Hi, friends and family. Hi, loved ones, and gardeners, and magicians, and fools. Hey, I'm just coming back on here and starting part 2 and continuing some themes around fertility, growth, transformation, initiation, transformation, transition, and completion. Yeah, that we're all going through simultaneously, all these things, the old and the new. So, yeah, linking the two to become whole. Yes, and just to be present. So, to be more conscious and more aware, to operate in the world through like ways that are true for us, true ways of being, true ways of operating, true ways of relating and being all we are. And so, yeah, in the last video, I shared a little bit about a dream that I had and about completion themes and initiation and integration and continuation of all these things. So I had shared a little bit about a dream and was talking about the 4 survival archetypes. As Caroline Mace has her own system, but I draw from like all systems and all traditions, like things that feel right or resonate with me, and I weave them into my tapestry and my alchemical play practice that I get to choose for me. Getting to know me, getting to become aware of misdirected energy, or where I can direct misaligned energy or energy unexplored power that I haven't been aware of, and be accountable for what's been created and what's been chosen. You know, all those things. Being responsible for myself and my well-being and my independence and spiritual maturity, all those things. And so I was reading a little bit about the shadow and the divine, actually like living in the shadow, from Sacred Contracts, Caroline Mace. And I got cut off, which is kind of funny because I'm going to talk about the dismemberment next. And those themes were emerging last June of feeling cut off. And I was like, oh, that was like part of my dismemberment stage during that initiation. And so it all is coming around again. So for review, to practice, what I've learned and continue, and play back and play through. So I'll just start where we left off. How's that? So we're talking about the child, the victim, the prostitute, and the saboteur. So judging others and creating excuses while knowing better are only 2 of the spiritual challenges that will arise as you work with your survival archetypes. The more aware you are of the demands of managing your consciousness, the fewer hiding places will be available in your psyche and soul for the shadow play of the child, victim, prostitute, and saboteur. This relationship between awareness and responsibility also applies to your health. Once you become aware of how toxic anger or guilt is to your body and spirit, the consequences of these energy poisons become more pronounced than if you did not know better. If for no other reason than that you know now their biological effects, this is negative visualization in action. So, the relationship between awareness and responsibility also applies to your health. So, we're not just like this physical body, even though that's like what we generally like kind of identify as when we think of as ourselves. We have a lot of different bodies, and there are like all these aspects of mind and heart, like our mental, our emotional, our spiritual, our physical, imaginal, astral, dreaming body. It's all these bodies that we have, all these energy fields, at play within the one field. And so it's like harmonizing all the parts of the whole into a coherent whole. Synthesis and blending, integration and individuation. A blending of the whole, a blending of all parts of the whole. So let's go on to the shadow and your divine potential, because this one, there was so much gold in it, and I was like, oh my gosh. And this perfect time is right now for that. So let's get into that. The shadow and your divine potential. Jesus said to his disciples about his miraculous healing abilities, all this ye shall do and more if you have faith. The Buddha's enlightenment not only allowed him to view his past lives going back aeons, but to become omniscient as well. Yet he also told his followers that with diligence they too could achieve enlightenment, and he urged them to be lamps unto yourselves. These enlightened beings saw our highest potential is virtually unlimited. They were not necessarily referring to learning how to walk on water or effect miraculous cures, however, but to the fact that we can become as trusting of the divine as they. The Buddha, for example, insisted that his followers discover who they would be if they called their spirits back from attaching to the illusions of the external world. So let me read that again. The Buddha, for example, insisted that his followers discover who they would be if they called their spirits back from attaching to the illusions of the external world. And Jesus said, unto you it is given to know the mystery of the kingdom of God. Do you bring it in a lamp to put it under a bushel or a bed? Instead, don't you put it on its stand? For whatever is hidden is meant to be disclosed, and whatever is concealed is meant to be brought out into the open. Mark 4:11 and 21 through 22. To engage in the journey that takes us from living outside of ourselves to processing the world inside ourselves means bringing light to our shadow. Your shadow aspects are primarily rooted in your fear patterns that have more control over your behavior than does your conscious mind. This limits your ability to make choices in which you are aware of your motivations. Your shadow self includes emotional and psychological patterns that come from repressed feelings that you do not wish to deal with consciously for fear of the consequences. For example, rather than face the fact that your partner is in some kind of trouble or your child is using drugs, you may repress those strong, accurate instincts, possibly with disastrous results. And you may become short-tempered, angry, and depressed without realizing why. Your shadow also contains the secret reasons why you would sabotage the opportunities that come your way. People often tell me they have a fear of success. When I ask them to explain where that fear came from, many draw a blank. It's because they're programs. They're unconscious. Programs that we haven't become aware of yet. But we can become aware of them. So they have no idea why they have that fear. They just do. Having an unknown force controlling so much of the creative expression of our lives is a shadow. Eventually, we have to confront each of our shadow aspects. This exploration into our shadow is so complex that it may be one reason why Eastern philosophy maintains that we need many lifetimes to achieve liberation. Your highest potential, then, is the part of you that is not limited in its expression by the fears of the physical world and the business of living. It is what you actualize when you are willing to confront your shadow, openly acknowledge the reality of its presence within you, and then take the steps to deal with it, to care for it, to express care, to rely on your inner resources and to follow your inner guidance. Well, I was going to say inner guardians. Inner guidance before all else is to express your highest potential at all times. To rely on your inner resources and to follow your inner guidance before all else is to express your highest potential at all times. It shows you who you would be if you could live constantly within the knowledge that genuine power exists inside the self and never outside of it. Confronting your shadow requires that you strike out on your own. That isn't to say that you can't receive help from friends, therapists, and wise counselors, but you will have to make choices that exclude the collective needs of your family, tribe, or group and separate yourself from them. If you do decide to follow an inner call and its unavoidable psychic ritual of separation, you have to withdraw your spirit from the magnetic field created by the collective power of your group's will so that you can organize your own energy, much as a mystic or seer might withdraw to hear divine promptings, like Jesus going into the desert or Muhammad to the cave of Mount Hira. This process of birthing your own power requires that you put yourself first, even though this may appear to the outside world to be selfish. During your separation, you will have to face the most narcissistic aspects of your ego, such as the shadow child, who is concerned only with its own well-being and will try to scare you back into the fold. Your shadow victim, meanwhile, revels in its victimhood and will entice you to feel sorry for yourself for ever leaving. The shadow prostitute will urge you to sell out your integrity and your vision of true independence at the first opportunity, and the shadow saboteur will play to your suspicions that you just aren't good enough to accomplish anything on your own. You will have to strengthen your soul identity until it is strong enough to eclipse all these fears. You are birthing your power of individual choice, increasing your potential for insight and for opportunity serving your highest potential. In dealing with the shadows, you ready yourself to accept full responsibility for the management of your spirit and the consequences of your choices. So it's like, yeah. So what have we created? And what did we choose? What are we choosing now? And what choices are those creating for us? And so that's interesting too, like all of these different archetypes. The child who can be a narcissist because, that's just kind of what we learned in certain ways, like in order to get our needs met. And certain dynamics that play out through certain relationships. And then the victim, too, like being a fragile, covert narcissist. Playing the victim that way, where we tell our sob stories to anyone who will listen or to reinforce that, oh, poor me, the poor me stories, which is interesting. And the whore, the prostitute, will urge you to sell out your integrity and your vision of true independence. And the shadow saboteur will play to your suspicions that you aren't good enough. So there's the not enough story right there. You'll have to strengthen your soul identity until it is strong enough to eclipse all of these fears. So, shadow contracts. Just as your archetypes are neither good nor bad, so too your sacred contract is essentially a neutral force. One person's contract is not more important to the universe than another's. Every contract is essentially the same in that it covers what each individual needs to learn in his lifetime. For that reason, we are put in places and in roles that best serve our contracts, whether that means we are born into royalty or poverty or somewhere in between. Whether you find yourself in a life filled with challenges such as serious illness, injury, or war, or whether your life is relatively free of trauma, you will have agreements to keep and a contract to fulfill. As the Tibetan Buddhist teacher Sogyal Rinpoche likes to say, there is poor people suffering and rich people suffering. Don't envy others because you can't know the extent of their suffering just by looking at externals. Whatever your material lot in life, any external difficulties are vehicles for you to work on your internal challenges. On some level, it's obviously much easier to be rich than poor, but even the prosperous cannot sidestep their inner challenges or their appointment in samsara. In this regard, people often ask me if a contract can include an agreement to commit murder, rape, or other heinous crimes. Could Hitler, Stalin, Mao, or Pol Pot have had contracts to murder millions of people? Questions about such enormous villainy are difficult to answer, but no, these criminals did not have a divine order to kill. It may be that some people have agreed to a life in which they encounter dark forces and have to choose how to deal with them. As each of us is growing individually, we are also evolving collectively. Each of us has a dark side along with our own grace and light. The extent to which we can acknowledge the former while maximizing the latter may determine how we choose to fulfill the terms of our contract. When the shadow side takes over even one person, the consequences are tragically felt by many. Even psychiatrists and brain scientists cannot offer a conclusive response to the question of whether individual people are born to murder. Social psychologist Stanley Milgram, his groundbreaking book, Obedience to Authority, demonstrated that often it is not so much the kind of person a man is as the kind of situation in which he finds himself that determines how he will act. Milgram developed the controversial obedience experiments, which I've mentioned several times. Yes, and in the last couple of videos as well, I have. So, Milgram developed the controversial obedience experiments conducted at Yale University in 1961 and 1962, in which subjects were told by scientific authority figures to administer electric shocks to another person if he answered a question incorrectly, no matter how that person reacted. Milgram had expected that American subjects would not follow orders that seemed to hurt another person, especially if the person being shocked were screaming and in obvious pain. Yet he found surprisingly that 65% of his subjects, ordinary residents of New Haven who were willing to give apparently harmful electric shocks up to 450 volts to a protesting and seemingly suffering victim. Of course, the shock machine was a sham, and the subjects were not really hurting the other people, who merely pretended to be in pain and even begged for mercy as stronger and stronger shocks were supposedly administered. Sadly, though, Milgram reported with numbing regularity, good people were seen to knuckle under to the demands of authority and perform actions that were callous and severe. In the aftermath of World War II, when people had assumed that Germans were more influenced by orders than other cultures, the obedience experiments were a cultural shock for Americans who prided themselves on being nonconformist. As Milgram said, it may be that we are puppets controlled by the strings of society, but at least we are puppets with perception, with awareness, and perhaps our awareness is the first step to our liberation. What is in one is in the whole. Murder and torture occur because humanity as a group does not yet sufficiently value life in all its expressions. Perhaps that lack of a sacred vision leads to the incarnating of bleak and brutal experiences. We all share a potential for becoming either the instigator or the victim of harm, whether physical or emotional. What we do to heal the victim and the aggressor within ourselves is the universal contribution we can each make toward healing the whole. And if we are ever to achieve our highest potential, we need to be, at the very least, puppets with awareness. People who committed heinous crimes, including mass murder, did have other options to learn what they needed to learn. They had the choice to act appropriately and morally, just as we all do, but they exercised their free will, chose wrongly, and heaped untold suffering on others. Ultimately, I believe they themselves do suffer, whether in this life or the next, or both. Perhaps these individuals have agreed to act as reflections of the darkest shadows of human nature. Although God has not assigned them to commit great evils, they may have been presented with a choice to act, and evil is one outcome of their choice. It is a basic spiritual impulse to try to find meaning even in tragedy, which awakens our need for greater action, justice, and protection of human rights. Uncivilized behavior, murder, and tyranny strengthen our belief in civilization, and democracy. I don't know if it strengthens my belief in democracy, because I'm a spiritual anarchist, but I do believe in cooperation and being in service to the whole. And I do believe in self-ownership and owning our power and our responsibility, claiming our freedom, power, and accountability. So undisguised bigotry and hatred wake us